I'm always really inspired by people who have this intrinsic inner drive to challenge themselves to get better, even when things are going great, right? And I think this is something that's like at the very heart of what makes us human is that we have this inner aspiration to grow into like the fullest expression of ourselves in this lifetime. And I love meeting and learning about people who just seem like to do it really naturally. And I'm really excited for this episode because my guest today has really done this throughout his whole life. And I'm thrilled to talk to him about where that comes from and how it's represented itself in his career. His name is Mike Novosel, and he leads strategic partnerships and alliances at StackAdapt. He's got over a decade of experience in ad tech and financial services and marketing technologies. And he's had a variety of roles in sales over the last decade, including most recently as chief revenue officer at 2 startups. And I love that he's got startup experience and big company experience because having had those two, I know they're quite different. So I'm excited to learn from his experience in both. So with that, Mike, welcome to Reinventability.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited for our conversation. All right. So I want to dive right in. And, I know a bit about you. We've had a conversation before. I know some of your story, but I'd love for you, like you have, as I said in my intro, you seem to have this really like intrinsic natural drive to constantly grow, to challenge yourself to grow, even when it's really uncomfortable, even when things seem to be going fine. And I'd love for you to share where that comes from or where you think that comes from. Is this how you've always been? Was there a pivotal life moment that kind of set you on this trajectory?
Oh man, that's a good question. For me, it comes from a place. It's kind of a bit of a funny answer, but on one hand, it came from the fact that I grew up basically with my grandparents. So my grandfather was essentially my dad growing up. I didn't meet my dad till I was a little bit older in life. My parents got divorced when I was basically a year old. But my grandfather, he came from a family of immigrants and uh, grew up in Queens, Far South specifically in New York City, and worked his way up from literally working in a boiler room, doing double shifts in multiple buildings in Rock Center toward being an executive at a really large commercial real estate company. So it was one of those things like the environment I grew up in was literally seeing front and center like how much hard work could create opportunity for someone that came from nothing and like candidly did probably in my grandfather's own words like on paper didn't deserve that opportunity necessarily. Watching that, it was inspiring. It was like, look, if he can do it, anyone can. And I'm going to carry it with me too. Uh, I'd say that the second thing, by extension of that, was that because my mom was divorced when I was really young, she missed out on an opportunity that I'd say a lot of other working mothers were afforded of like being able to go to college, having a college degree, and then a career experience. So my mom, after she divorced my brother's father, I always watched her like scrambling to do part-time work. I literally remember like going to jobs in condos where she was cleaning floors when I was like a little kid and sitting there doing a coloring book while she was in the middle of cleaning just to make money. Going all the way to like taking care of dogs to cooking food for people as like a part-time chef to going to Westchester Community College for night school to like try to get a degree in graphic design. So I think the second part of it too was just watching my mom go through that experience of like, if you don't put in the effort early on and just expect that life's going to come to you. Not that my mom did by any means, but she was part of the generation. And I think, a lot of people were assuming that, oh, you just get married. But my mom got caught flat footed and had to react to that. And I give her a lot of credit for it. But, I think it instilled this sense upon me that I needed to like really dig in and lean into capturing the opportunity in front of me whenever it was presented to myself. I had this fear of like not having momentum that was just ingrained in my head.
That's so
So that's
interesting.
probably how.
Yeah, no, but I love in what you share. It's almost like you had these two, like two sources for that. Right? One is, as you said, like you had this amazing example in your grandpa of what is possible. And then you had that, almost like a push inside of seeing what happens if you don't dream bigger and challenge yourself of what could happen. And so those two propelled you in that way, right? To have this fear of not, I love this, the way you just put it, the fear of not having momentum. You know, it's interesting just listening to you. I think naturally, you know, we reflect on our own experience. I don't think I ever realized this, Mike, but I think I have a fear of standing still. I never even thought about it. Like, yeah. Tell me more about this fear of not having momentum. I think there's a big insight there. And like how it's propelled you after that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I just noticed over time, like going through the last couple of career experiences, that like anytime I felt stagnant, and I'm also, that it correlates to not feeling as like emotionally invested and passionate about what I'm doing, which then usually exacerbates this flywheel of like being less engaged and not necessarily living up to my potential. And that's the thing that ultimately like starts to really eat at me deep down. So, like people usually say time's like your most valuable asset. Like I think professionally for me, it's, yeah, obviously I don't want to waste a single minute that I ever have the opportunity to produce something or create value for my family. But it really, to that last point, like it comes from a place more of I think the moment I notice I'm sitting still, I don't feel like I'm reaching further up, and I don't feel like I'm necessarily doing as much as I can to then make those around me realize that I'm leaving it on the table to go support them. And that applies not just to my family, but also the teams that I'm part of as well. And I think, you know, by extension of that, like I was a college athlete and I played sports growing up since probably the day I was 5 years old, the day I was legally allowed to. Uh, and that's the same mentality, like, you know, it gets ingrained in your head in sports is like, you know, you have a class of athletes that are usually the ones that they beat themselves up even after the good games because there's that one or two things that they knew they could have done better. And that's the sort of thing that like I think just perpetuated in me both on the field and off the field, as well as like now later in life. I just, you know, it's always been brainwashed into me that I don't want to leave an opportunity on the table and take it for granted.
Yeah. And you know, it's interesting. I'm not usually a proponent, or I would say I'm never a proponent of doing something out of fear, right? Because when we do something out of fear, you know, I work with a lot of leaders, I mentor a lot of leaders, and we always talk about you can either do something from love or fear. Love, I don't mean romantic love. Like love is excitement or a sense of purpose or a passion that you have or responsibility for your family or your team. Fear is more, that's where our ego comes in, right? Fear is more from scarcity, like, oh, if I don't do this, I'll fail. And so it's interesting to me because you say that you have this fear of losing momentum, and yet I see real love in you for a challenge. Like I see real excitement to challenge yourself. And I actually want to ask you a specific thing, because this really stuck with me when you and I connected. You were talking about, you were at this company called Cardlytics. You can share a little bit about what it does. And there was a business line in it, or a business that was part of the company that you said was just not doing well and people couldn't figure out how to grow it. And you raised your hand and said, let me do this. And when you were saying that, you know, I was spent 20 years in corporate. I was like, wow, that's crazy. Why would you do that? You know, you're taking over a failing business. Like, and so I'd love for you to talk about that and how that connects to what we just talked about, this excitement that you have to push yourself, like beyond where you feel you are.
Yeah. So, so the specific circumstance was I was feeling pretty tapped out individually where, you know, I'd say for the last, call it, a couple of years preceding this moment in time in my career, I'd done really well as an individual contributor, and I'd been given ample opportunity to expand into kind of like dual remit where you're hybrid coach player sort of roles. And I think the thing that exposed me to was like, wow, I actually really enjoy building things. And I like paused and I reflected. I'm like, well, it's ironic because as a little kid, like I was the type of kid that would take things apart, put them back together. Like, you know, your classic kids that are much more into arts and everything like that. I was the one that had like the erector and like connect sets and like sat there for hours just building random things because my mind worked that way. I was wired that way. So in this moment, when I was kind of raising my hand to say, look, like I'm feeling tapped out, I'm doing really well at what I'm doing, which was, you know, co-leading new business at the time. And I had a team underneath me. I'm like, where else is there a challenge in the company? And I started to get very vocal with my own manager about, hey, I'm feeling like I'm just not growing as much, like I'm stagnating. And usually I do my best work when I'm not stagnating. thankfully my boss at the time was someone I worked with for a while. So even he knew that about me. Like, I have to throw things at him to keep him engaged, or else I am disadvantaged by virtue of that. So the specific opportunity that came up was that there was this vertical, the way the company was structured was very similar to other software companies. We have verticals where you try to instill subject matter expertise because it matters to win business there. And this specific team was focused on grocery, fuel, and convenience, which I literally knew nothing about. I've never worked at all with anything in the grocery, fuel, and convenience. But it was an interesting challenge because, it was not faltering necessarily of going down. It was more so that it just had not grown. And there had not been necessarily a lot of inertia in scaling it. And I looked at it and I'm like, well, ironically, this is an extension of the challenge I'm used to solving, which is scaling new business, building teams, but then now it's doing it and exposing it in an area I have no subject matter expertise whatsoever. So I raised my hand because to me, it looked like a good professional opportunity to go prove, hey, if I could do this in a typical state, can I also go transcend and carry those skills over into a place where I, in theory, would not have to be successful? And thankfully, just by being curious, I was. So, some of the things I had shared last time was that, and something I also try to instill upon my teams is that any growth function, you need to also embody a mentality of personal growth as you do professional growth in order for the team to therein grow. So what I mean is I looked in the mirror and I said, I don't know jack squat about grocery, fuel, and convenience. That is okay.
Who does?
No one. Yeah, not many people do. Not many people do in general. So, but I asked myself, I'm like, all right, how do I start? Right? I read. I go figure out where those companies live, the buyer profiles that would engage with us, but then exist within grocery, fuel, and convenience. And I honestly just started to reach out to people I know and said, who are the people that if you were in my shoes, and you needed help building a business, who are subject matter experts that you would call on that can help you? And I started there. And I'm very thankful for even taking that very simple approach, because it's stuck with me still now is it's okay to walk into an environment, be vulnerable, acknowledge what you do and you don't know, and make it clear to everyone around you that that's okay to be psychologically secure in that regard. But don't be shy to ask for help. So in this situation, I was not shy. I went and asked for help. And after reaching out to a bunch of people in my network on LinkedIn, I ended up, as one small example, getting in touch with a woman by the name of Meredith Sadlowski, who's the former chief marketing officer at Gulf, based up in the Boston area. And she happened to do consulting on the side, and she happened to do consulting for tech companies. And I ended up hiring her, and she was a mentor to me and helped me get the business off the ground. But that small experience alone, it helped me hire some of the best people, because then she referred me to people and I met new people. I was able to understand the challenges that the vertical went through. I was able to understand how to articulate our value relative to those challenges. And then it was much easier to then scale and replicate thereafter. So a small example of just we're being admissive of where you have room to grow, curious, you can accomplish anything. Yeah. So yeah, it was a fun experience.
I love this story so much because, this podcast is called reinventability, and I made up this term, and my definition of reinventability is this capacity that I believe we all have to envision a more valuable future and then to take steps to proactively shape it. Right. And, what you just shared is the embodiment of that. You envision yourself as someone who can grow this business, even though you don't know jack squat about the specifics of it. And then you took steps to figure that out, including, and taking those steps. I love that you talk about curiosity and vulnerability, because it's impossible to grow without being vulnerable, because growth means new things. And how do we learn to do new things? For some reason, I just thought of when my daughter Mia, who's now 20, was learning how to walk. Well, she fell all the time. It wasn't some smooth, beautiful process. And that's growth, right? But eventually you do it. And so I love that you talk about vulnerability, because I even wrote down a note from last time we connected about cold calling people, and that's something I want to zero in on that, because, a lot of leaders are listening to this. I work with a lot of leaders, and for people who've kind of in a significant, successful place in their career, I find that it's often, and I'm raising my hand too, like it's difficult to then be the beginner in something, right? It's difficult to then say, I don't know how to do this. I need help. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because I feel like that's again, this great ability that you've used for your own reinvention and growth. And I just love for you to talk about that a little bit, because I think it's essential. I think without that, we really can't grow into our full potential, as you were talking about.
Mhm.
And I think that blocks a lot of people, especially people who've attained a certain degree of success, and then feels like, I should know this, shouldn't I?
And you want me to start with the cold calling part of it?
Yeah, because I think that's the ultimate scariest thing in the world.
Yeah. Well, I'd say there were two like career experiences that early on got me used to the sense of like, I'll call it overcoming rejection, if you will, or psychological perceived opportunity of rejection. So one of them was I worked on a trading floor at a college. So I worked at Royal Bank of Canada, and I was first kid in my family to go to college. I went to Dartmouth and I played sports there, and I went to grants, paid my way through school with the help of my grandfather a little bit along the way, and then had some loans coming out of college, which thankfully working at RBC helped me pay. But the reason I share that experience first and foremost is that I went to school with a lot of kids that had parents or family members that worked on Wall Street, so they had like a very natural glide path to get in there. Whereas for me, I had to figure it out. Like I, on paper, looked like a good candidate for it, but I lacked that. I know someone at this bank that can help me get this job. Uh, so what did I do is I literally went online and I started to Google, like, what are the top 10 investment banks in New York? And I just started to cold outreach to people, introduce myself, send my resume. And lo and behold, Royal Bank of Canada was one of them. And they were like a perfect fit for where I could get exposed to this, because they were not big enough, but they were big enough in New York where it was a good experience for me. But they were also like looking for top talent, but gritty people that were trying to build a name for themselves. So I was an intern there, and an intern, as you would expect with any internship, you're learning as much as you can during the course of like 9 to 5, but it's, you're just getting exposed to dynamics. And the goal is obviously get a job, the internship, so that you know what your career is going to be in college. So for me, I was in a small class of interns, and I'd say everyone else in the intern class was what you would expect as part of the intern class. And whereas I was obviously very invested in doing all the day-to-day stuff that was part of the internship, like one thing I did differently that I think really helped me in the long run was I got in first to work every day, and I said, what's one way to get on everyone's radar so that they don't forget and that they remember who I am and that I'm more likely to get this job. So I did coffee runs every day. I did breakfast runs, afternoon coffee runs, and I made a point to remember everyone's name, something small to talk to them about. And I made a point to like bust my, to hustle and get it to them as quickly as possible. And like that small feat alone, which culturally was like very much a norm on Wall Street, because, like it ingrained in my mind that it's half, like hustle is equally as big of a part of it, and showing your willingness to get out of your comfort zone. I stuck out because a lot of my peers, they would just focus on the work day to day, right? And they weren't necessarily focused on the relationship building. So that was one part of it that I think it just like innately pushed me to get outside of my shell, because I'm like, if I don't do this, how else am I going to differentiate myself and stick out? By extension of that, when I ended up leaving my job at a hedge fund after I went to RBC, I saw all my friends going to tech. So the first job I got in tech was a sales development rep. It's a common job, and it's usually a junior job coming out of college. But the job is usually oriented around booking meetings for sales reps, right? So like it's very high volume game. Like, how do you get someone who has literally zero interest in talking to a 20-something-year-old to agree to talk to a 20-something-year-old?
Yeah.
And what that experience taught me, and part of why I was able to be really successful at it, was that I was watching similarly a lot of my peers be so focused on like the pitch and the value proposition and like why they should care about this company that I worked at and what I was about to tell them. What I did differently was, before I even called them, I would research and I would look up something personal, and I would find the common thread of connection, and I would get them on the phone, and then I would, it would be anything along the lines of how I'm at business school and how I'm like a really eager to learn from them young kid. And that worked very well because a lot of people, when they know the other person on the end of the line is someone that's actually trying to build their career, like you would find people lower their barrier and are very eager and willing to impart knowledge and share with someone, which worked very well in my favor in that regard. But also, it's something that still sticks with me to this day when I teach my own teams, some of which still include like people that have been doing this for like 15 years, longer than I have. That like at the end of the day, if you're talking to someone across the table in a value exchange for the first time, like if they have an option between talking to someone who created a common thread and they know is being human versus someone that just jumps straight into business, like they're always going to pick this path. Because at the end of the day, we're people, right? Like the work is like only a portion of the day. So one thing that, I think that experience imparted upon me that I carried with me is that no matter what sales job or sales leadership job I've ever had, it's how do you best communicate to the person in front of you that we're both people. Like I care about you enough to be attentive to what matters to you in your day to day and walk in knowing that. And by extension of that, you should trust that when I talk to you about ways I can help you, like I'm not just trying to jam a product across the table at you. I'm trying to actually help you. So building trust in that regard and creating common ground is like one of the things that I think being exposed to making under $50 a day as a 20-something.
I'm envisioning like, what's that movie, Boiler Room? And I know you weren't in that. Yeah, but I'm envisioning that, the phone bank, and then, I guess in your case, you weren't selling fraudulent things and FBI did not appear.
No, none of that.
But it
was,
none of that. Yeah. Hopefully. Now, the cool thing, Mike, and as we talk more, like it's very viscerally clear that, again, like you're someone who is excited, not just is able to tolerate the discomfort of growing and learning new things, but actually is excited by that, which I think is a really awesome quality. And, I work a lot with leaders and like high performance people. And there's always a question of like, okay, well, I feel like you said at the beginning, like I'm tapping into like, I'm getting stagnant. I want to do more. I want to have greater impact. I want to grow more. And often I hear that from a place of, it's almost like the should. It's just what I should do. It doesn't feel like it's what they want. It's like they think it's what they should do. And like just listening to you now, like, I don't know, you're smiling. Like you have great, for those of you just listening, like on video, like you're excited by this challenge. You're excited even by the vulnerability of it. And I love that you share that with your team. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about like that part of it of how do you, because now you said you manage a team and you have some people on the team who have more experience in sales than you do, but how do you think about this for yourself and instilling this in your team? Like just this excitement for growth and high performance versus like doing it from a place of, this is something I feel I should, or this is the expectation, or, if I don't do this, I'm out of a job.
Oh man, where do I start on that one?
It's not a suggested management strategy for everyone listening.
No, not at all. So it's funny, like you bring this one up because I had this discussion recently with one of the individuals on my team, and it was one of those things that when I went through it, like 2014, this moment, I remember my boss pulling me aside and saying, "Hey, don't conflate professional growth with personal growth, right?" It maybe didn't say it in that, but mentally, I'd say everyone in the world is wired to think like title, bump, increase, you name it, up in the corporate hierarchy correlates toward like I will be more fulfilled when I feel tapped out or when I feel like I'm not emotionally invested. And the reality, whether for better or for worse, that I'd say anyone that's kind of gone through that motion before is like you don't end up realizing that that's actually not the case until you hit that ceiling, and then you're unhappy when you've hit that ceiling. And for me, I think, I've run into this a couple times now, right? But mentally for me, that was like, I continue to check the boxes. Great. I'm ready for the next level. I'm continuing to check the boxes. I'm ready for the next level. And I think, especially from someone that went from being literally a junior BDR to then doing chief revenue officer work, that was sort of the path I was on. And it wasn't until I got to that level and I got exposed to it that I'm like, you know what? maybe this isn't what I had been looking for all along. Like, this isn't the thing that was missing of being happy, right? Because I actually ended up feeling less happy some days than I had originally felt before when I had moved into those seats. So, to bring it back to like talking to the teams and stuff, I generally say like, I try to start small and say like, look, we're having this discussion about like your career growth right now, but have you really sat down and said to yourself, like, let me think of a day that I had the best day at work possible, or that I had remove work even, right? Like just a day in your personal life, you had an awesome day. Write it out. What happened, right? Who were you around? What were you doing? What type of activity were you doing? Were you alone? Were you with other people? Were you outside? Were you doing work? Like what was it, right? And when you start to do that, you start to unpack and realize like these are the things that generally, when I'm in these sorts of situations and in these sorts of environments, get me the most energized. And it may be that in doing that and thinking through it that way, you realize, oh, there is a role that, ironically enough, presents plenty of opportunity for that one-off daily occurrence I had at work that was really exciting and felt so energized to happen daily. I
Yeah.
just hadn't thought about it, and I hadn't thought about talking to my manager about that. But it sounds like such maybe a simple way to think through it, but it's something for me that I was like, all right, well, what makes me most energized is building things, working with great people, learning from those people, being afforded freedom to make decisions and take risks, but then having guardrails around it. Oh, what type of roles orient themselves toward affording that opportunity? Ones that I found myself very happy in. So
Yeah.
hopefully that kind of gives you one way to think of it.
No, I think there's a lot of deep insights there, Mike. And just for what it's worth, you can come work with me one of these days, because this best day exercise is actually, so in this, I've developed this reinventability framework, which is this 5-step process that I take people through when I work with them to, envision this more valuable future they want, and then actually, grow into it. But we begin, because people always say, oh, like, I know, like, let me describe. And I said, before you tell me about that. And so I have this whole reflection exercise that they go through, which includes one of the questions is describe your best day that you've had in the last year. And it also like invites them to really reflect on, the moments in your life where you felt most purposeful, most excited, most energized. Or one of my favorite questions to ask people is, what feels deeply good to you? And it's really just making me think of this, because I work with a lot of, brilliant high achievers. Like, these people like have incredible achievements and resumes. And that question stumps a lot of them, like, because they say, you know what, I have no idea, and I haven't thought about this in 20 years, right?
Yep.
And so I think it's really important what you said, that, personal growth and fulfillment did not necessarily correlate directly with how high up you go in your professional growth. And I think the experience you described is something we've all experienced. I've experienced this. I've written about books about this, where just when I thought I was at the height of success, quote unquote, I burnt out or felt really low. So I think it's a really important insight. And I wonder if you would talk just a little bit more, because I think it's really important. Like you said, you've had a couple instances in your life where you got to that place of, the ultimate professional achievement at the time, but actually realized you were less happy. Can you talk about that, and then what you did from there? Because I think that is something that a lot of people experience.
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, I'll boil it down to like one very blatantly obvious one that sunk in. One, since I've kind of revisited that thing that's really important to me in the last couple of months, but two, also when it was absent, which was being around my family and being present with my family more. So once I started my hand at startup world, I think one thing I quickly learned was that when you're generally in an environment where you have more constrained resources and it's all hands on deck, like, not to say that most jobs aren't around the clock any day, but like you have no choice but to be way more invested in the success or failure of the company, because you are very much more collective, or much more responsible for a larger percentage of that success or failure story, because there's only so many people to come to, right? And that goes for everyone beyond C-suite as well at that company, because it's the nature of startups. But in both situations where I was in that position, I think one thing I started to observe was I wasn't feeling as energized at work. I was definitely putting on weight, for example, which was a very blatant validation of the fact that I wasn't necessarily taking care of myself as much. And my happiness was going down because I was waking up and then also going to bed every day going like, holy hell, if I don't figure this thing out, the company may not end up where it should be or it could be. And then when I started to unpack it more, I started to realize like, oh, you know what? Like the thing that's actually really bothering me the most is like, I'm not able to be around my kids as much as I used to be. And, where this I'd say sunk into me the most was when in my previous job, I got back to going in and commuting 3 days a week back and forth. And I started to realize like, oh, wow, I'm waking up really, really early, which again, no issue with whatsoever, but I'm getting sad when I have to watch my kids run out the door and say goodbye, Dad. And then I have to rush home, even just to make it in time to just like put them to bed and say goodnight. In that period of time, I probably maybe recaptured like 20 minutes of the day that historically when I had a less stressful and more flexible work-life balance, I had maybe probably like 3 to 5 hours outside hours because I was commuting, and then I can control my schedule more and I can catch up on things after kids go to bed versus, spending all day in a corporate office building. And I'll say this, like at least so far since I rejoined a remote first company and I'm now around my family again. Like I've lost a significant amount of weight. I feel way better. I feel happier at work. And I know my kids like value it too, because during the day now, like just the amount of time and attention when I ask them how their day went that they give me, I can drop them off at school, they're ecstatic when I'm picking them up. Like those were the little things that I think before when I was conflating growth with professional, moving up the ladder versus like what are the things that actually make me happy every day. I was like, oh my gosh, wow, overlooked it. Like it's actually making sure I have enough time around my family. That was a huge part of it. But it took, again, getting back to a different environment to make me realize that, because otherwise I would have taken it for granted and I probably wouldn't have arrived upon the conclusion as quickly as I did.
Yeah. And I think that speaks to a few things. One is just the importance of like continually reflecting on your values as you grow in your career. I think it's something I definitely didn't do for a long time. I kind of just, I was presented with all kinds of incredible opportunities and I busted my ass and I did the best and I kept growing and growing. But until I fully burnt out 9 years ago, I don't ever remember sitting down and thinking about like my best day or even things like, what do I value? Right. So I think it speaks to the importance of that. But can you speak a little bit? Because, as I'm listening to you, it's like totally makes sense. And I can just hear some people's brains go, well, it's nice if you can have the flexibility, but like, it's almost like, how do you balance those two? Like this desire to really like, reach your full potential professionally and this desire to really like unleash that. Cause I can really relate to that too. And so can you I'm not going to say it's a conflicting desire, but sometimes they feel like they're in conflict, right? To be present with your family and have time. So, there's no formula, but I'd love to just hear your thoughts around that because it's something I think about quite a bit.
So you're also catching me in a moment where I'm like reflecting upon this right now, which is that usually, like I was definitely guilty of conflating quantity and volume of output with like quality of development that extends from that output necessarily. And I try to like unpack this and look back at like, where did this get ingrained in my DNA? I like to think that it actually happened when I worked on Wall Street because I had to sit in front of the screen and go, bah, 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 like make markets all day. And by extension of that, when I became a salesperson, I was able to get through a ton of volume of like deal flow, managing a ton of stuff, which it was my superpower. Like anyone, if you ask them about like, what's their perception of me, it's generally like, he's a machine. I don't know how he operates like a robot that way. And I laugh at it because I'm like, to me, it's normal. But on the flip side of it, I think as I've moved into more managerial positions, the thing I'm trying to learn and get better at each and every day that I still haven't perfected is this lesson that like, quality over quantity sometimes, and that oftentimes people conflate doing more or getting more accomplishments or gold stars on the board correlates towards growth. And I'd like to give credit to my current boss in this regard, because he came from an environment that was very large, very structured, had been in a variety of roles. And his feedback to me is very much similarly along the same vein of like, sometimes when you slow down, you end up being able to go even faster, and you can end up achieving more. So there's moments that I have to catch myself, and I'm trying to get better at saying, hey, look, my normal way of doing things would be try to get these 50 things done in the day, and that should correlate toward me being a top performer and my team being a group of collective top performers. But for this to work scalably, sometimes when you try to tackle things at scale and volume, you end up creating more bottlenecks and impeding growth more than you actually end up accelerating it. Because you overlook things and you don't think about the patterns and you don't think about scalable ways to solve things, right? So I think that's one area that I will be the first to admit that I'm always trying to have room to improve and get better at. And it wasn't something, again, that I think I was really pushed to have to think through differently until I got put in a position where if I didn't, other people get impacted by it, not just myself. And when you care about those people, then you really pay attention to it.
Yeah, no, what I'm thinking about, I had a boss long time ago. Haven't had a boss in 8 years of running my own thing, but I had a boss a few careers ago, and I remember he said something that you're making me think of. He said, if you always treat time as the expandable asset, right? If you can just stay late or work another 2 hours, work another 4 hours, you're actually not being great at your job. And it was I can't even remember what, I was trying to remember what it was especially about. I can't remember the thing. But at the time, I don't think I honored that insight with as much attention as I should have. But I think what he was saying is a little bit what you're saying. If it's just, oh, well, I'll just do 2 more hours of work and then my team will do 2 more hours of work. And, oh, we have 4 more hours before it's midnight, right? That's not great leadership. And that also is then impacting your well-being. So instead of that, I think part of what you're talking about is really like saying, what if the time doesn't expand? How can I be better? How can we do this more effectively, efficiently? And, constraints are what's the saying? Constraint is the mother of creativity or something like that. I get every single cliche wrong always. I just say this for you and for our listeners. I use my hi, I'm a refugee, English is my second language card right now. But I literally, this actually wasn't even that bad. I mean, my best ones, and I've done this on a stage in front of 10,000 people where, what's that one where it's you throw out the baby with the bathwater? Yeah. But I mixed it with another cliche about you try to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. So I think I killed a baby with 2 stones and threw out a bird. So this is my but something like, I think when we have constraints, we're actually able, if we choose to, we're able to be more creative. We're able to come up. And I think that's what you're talking about, which makes a ton of sense. All right. We always have this segment where we have a question from one of our listeners, and I want to ask it to you today. And I think I'm excited to hear what you say about this. So I got an email from this awesome human actually a couple months ago. And he shared that he's actually was a sales executive for many years. I'm not sure which industry, but for many, many years in large companies. And 2 years ago, just went through this period of one of the companies he was working at, that business unit was sold and the job was eliminated. He took another job where he just really did not mesh with the leadership. And so he ended up leaving. And essentially what he wrote is, I just really lost my confidence in my ability to be great. And so he's been struggling for the last couple of years. He's like, I just don't seem to be able to get back into that place where I feel confident in my abilities. And I wonder what you'd say to this person, because I think it's a challenging place to be. And I wonder what insights you'd have or what advice you'd have based on kind of your ability to grow and reinvent.
Well, first I'd say is that everyone's been there before, whether you realize you're not alone. Because again, for those of us that have been there, it feels lonely and you think you're the only one going through it. But the more you have conversations with people, you realize that the scenes. Like a lot of people have gone through that exact moment you have. So I'd say the first step for me when I was in that moment was have conversations, reach out to friends, get a cup of coffee. And then what you start to realize is that you rebuild that confidence alone just by understanding that when you share what you've gone through, a lot of people, believe it or not, have gone through the same thing. You feel less alone. And when you feel less alone, you realize, hey, look, this isn't just me, right? Like this is a normal thing, and you accept it. And that, I think, really helped me when I've been in those moments before, kind of start to pick myself up and say, okay, like if other people have been through this before and they figured it out, I can too. And it starts to snowball and the energy starts to pick back up. And I think, when you start to think about, and now how do I do it, right? Don't ever overlook the power also of talking to the people that have seen you at your best, because more often than not, if that's the next step you take, you'll find that those people will remember when you were at your best. They'll know what you're capable of, and they'll direct you and they'll want to help you because they know what the potential that you can bring to that next company you go work at. So for me, when I've been in those moments, like those are some of the best times that I've actually found hidden opportunity that I didn't realize existed. And I've gotten the best advice that I've been, given before. But a lot of it, I'd say, just took me picking myself up and saying like, all right, I have to meet the world. The world's not going to meet me. And I'm going to have a conversation. And you end up finding that when you do that, the world actually gives you quite a bit back, and it starts to build momentum in that capacity. And then I think similar to the advice I gave about just thinking about your best days, right? Like for me, I think the humbling moment when I've been through these experiences before was because I was always trying to push myself to say, go do something different, go try a new industry, go do a new vertical. And I tripped a couple times by all means. Like it was definitely not perfect and it was not smooth right at all. I definitely failed along the way, but I got better for it. Is still ask yourself, what was that moment that I was great in? And what did the environment look like? What were the type of people I was around? What was the type of work I was doing? And then work backwards and say, okay, given that, how do I get back to that environment? And then as you talk to people, articulate to them like, hey, look, when we worked together last time, this was the setup. This is the type of work I was doing. Do you know of any places that exists? And you'll find, surprisingly, that just by positioning it that way, people will help you identify where you can be your best again resides, and they'll also vouch for you. And I think that brings you back to a place that you do feel like you're back to yourself. You are back on top of your game, and you're creating great work, great output, but also feeling very fulfilled in the process of it. So that's what my advice would be.
I love that advice. And I love the advice, Mike, of like reflecting back on when you were great at whatever it is and felt great, and then using that in your conversation. And it made me think of, I forget who said this, but it's a scientist. This is where I'm terrible at names. I wish I could remember names better. But he wrote that we didn't invent ships by observing items that sink in the water. We invented ships by observing items that float. And I think what you're talking about is when we're in a moment of low confidence or things are not working out or a business has failed, right? We've all been there a million times in different ways. That instead of the natural tendency, and I study the brain, so unfortunately I know this both personally and neuroscience, it goes into this negativity bias. It starts to, see, you're here because you're not good at this and you did this wrong and this is not going to work out, right? It kind of this reinforcing negativity bias. Instead, to focus on, well, when did I feel great? When did I really feel I was doing great? Studying the object that was floating and then using that as your baseline to go have the conversations. I think that's really powerful. I didn't think of connecting it to that. That's awesome.
Yep. Mike,
thank you. I've learned a lot. I every time we talk, I learn a lot. And I think this is the first podcast episode where I started taking notes. So that was a lot, which is hard because I don't want to miss something you're saying, but I wrote down things. I appreciate your vulnerability and being really honest in walking the walk. And I also really appreciate the grounded realness. I'm struggling for the words, but in the advice you share, right? And both with what you just shared with the listeners and how you talk to your team, I think that's the kind of leadership we're all really thirsty for now. It's, we say it's not the everything will be amazing, positive, confident leadership. Walk this way, everyone. And, but it's really authentic. And I think that says a lot about who you are. And I really appreciate that. So thank you. And that's what we got for our episode today. Thank you for joining me on this reinventability journey. If you have heard something that resonated with you, I'd love for you to rate and review this episode on your whatever podcasting platform you're listening on. It helps other people discover it. And if there's someone in your life who you think could really appreciate the conversation and the advice Mike has shared and his insights, please share it with them and be an awesome human and reach out. And that person might really need to hear what Mike had to say. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and I will see and hear you on our next episode.